Welcome to the Skeptic Zone, the podcast from Australia for science and reason.
Yes, it's the Skeptic Zone podcast, episode number 577 for the 3rd of November 2019. This is Richard Saunders coming to you this week from the Melbourne studios of the Skeptic Zone, well, otherwise known as the house of my friend and longtime skeptic Dr. Steve Roberts. I'm in Melbourne to have a quick visit and chat to some people about the upcoming SkepticCon in early December. In fact, I had a really nice evening just a few days ago with some of the Vic Skeptics Committee. We made a little promotional video for the convention. And I must say I'm very impressed with the venue, which is in Melbourne University. But more about that, I think, on next week's show as I chat to some more people about the upcoming convention. On this week's show, homeopathy. Again with the homeopathy. We speak once more to Michael Marshall from the Good Thinking Society in the UK, because the head of the NHS in the UK has launched a very outspoken attack on homeopathy and the peddling of deadly anti-vaccine myths. Michael Marshall will fill us in on the latest from that story. After that, it's part 2 of the CSICon interviews by guest reporter Rob Palmer. This week, Rob talks to Elizabeth Loftus about false memories, Jim Underdown about investigating paranormal claims, Janyce Boynton about facilitated communication, and Joe Schwarcz about demystifying science. Then to round off this week's episode, another reading from The Skeptic by the editor Tim Mendham. Tim is going to read an article called Geeks, Gamers, Nerds and Kids. Now, what is the crossover between nerds and skeptics? Probably quite a lot when I think about it. That's coming up to round off the show. Well, that's all from me at the moment. It's time for me to run out the door and have a rest, because last night Steve took me out to just around the corner to an all-you-can-eat Sri Lankan restaurant. Holy mackerel. Actually, there wasn't any mackerel on the menu. There were lots of wonderful vegetarian curries and a few meat ones, and these beautifully cooked Sri Lankan food if you're in Fitzroy North. While I go outside and recover from last night's dinner, I hope you enjoy the Skeptic Zone. Joining me now on the line from Liverpool in the UK, it's Michael Marshall. Hello, Marsh.
Hey, Richard. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for this. A quick interview, a quick catch-up, because just when I woke up this morning, I'm seeing lots of news coming out of the UK regarding homeopathy. Can you give our listeners a quick overview about this?
Yeah, absolutely. So long-time listeners might remember I was on the show a couple of months ago talking about the case we're bringing against the Society of Homeopaths, or rather the government body that's given a stamp of legitimacy to the Society of Homeopaths. And what actually happened is the head of NHS England, so the head of the NHS here in the UK, has actually written a letter of support for our kind of appeal, support for our case. And he sent this letter, which is quite a robust letter. I was very surprised to see how strong it actually was. He sent this letter to the Professional Standards Authority, who accredit the Society of Homeopaths. And this letter is explaining how it's misleading and dangerous for homeopaths to get government accreditation. It even goes as far as to say, and it's probably further than I would say, he says that anything that gives a veneer of legitimacy to homeopathy gives the opportunity for chancers to con the public out of their money and put their health at risk, which is incredibly strong stuff. And not only did he send this letter to the Professional Standards Authority, he also sent it to every national newspaper in the UK. And so it was actually front page of the Daily Mail print edition today, the main story. was the NHS, head of the NHS, throwing his support behind our calls to have the Society of Homeopaths stricken from the government register. So it's been quite an incredible day of coverage. Every single national newspaper in the UK has covered the story. I've been on several national radio stations talking about it, and to have the support and the weight of the NHS behind what we're doing is just a incredible incredible development, really.
It really is. What do you attribute the interest in the media, such a big interest in the media, to this story?
Well, I think there's a couple of elements to it, really. First of all, it's not often that the head of the NHS comes out and makes a statement like this. It's pretty much unprecedented. He occasionally has said some things about homeopathy, but for him to be so specific about what needs to be done is pretty huge, really. So there's that. There's also, as it happens at the moment, the Daily Mail is running a very high-profile campaign about vaccination. They're trying to, it's their campaign to, as they call it, end vaccine ignorance, and to raise awareness in the public of the importance of vaccines. So it's kind of a perfect time for the Mail to splash on this quite significantly. And I think it also comes just as we're seeing a lot of stories in the UK press at the moment about the falling vaccination rates. We are starting to get to a position where vaccination rates are dropping quite significantly. And fortunately, because we've got a media who remembers the last time around and remembers the part they played the last time around, the UK media is surprisingly responsible when it comes to vaccination information. So as we see more and more people starting to eschew vaccines, and more people like homeopaths saying that vaccines are dangerous, and all the kind of misinformation we see, the UK media is immediately recognising the dangers of this and is stepping in to sort of start their own campaigns to point out how dangerous it is and how important it is that we vaccinate. So I think it's come at just at the right time, where the media has the right sort of sensibility for this, and just as it's becoming a significant enough issue for us to be concerned about here in the UK.
And I think it is also credit to you and the Good Thinking Society for helping to provide the information and getting publicity out there, getting the general awareness of the community to a state that these sort of things are happening. And what I'll do, Marsh, after we say goodbye, I'll read a little bit about what the Daily Mail had to say in regards to this story. But what prompted, do you think, the head of the NHS to make such a strong statement?
Well, it's hard to know for sure. But I do know that at the moment, the Society of Homeopaths is seeking to be reaccredited for 2020. And as part of that, the PSA, the body who reaccredits them, has sort of cast a wide net looking for opinions and expertise and experience about whether the Society of Homeopaths should retain their status. And in doing that, I obviously sent them my opinion and my response, which was we do have concerns about the Society of Homeopaths. And if you want to know what those concerns are, look to the legal case we're currently bringing against you, because that contains a lot of those concerns. Yeah. But I also emailed and wrote to several different sort of medical bodies and medical authorities who've been vocal about homeopathy and vaccination. And one of them was NHS England and Simon Stevens, the head of NHS England. So I actually emailed NHS England and said, this consultation kind of thing is happening with the PSA. And if you feel as strongly about this as we do, it might be worth you sending some thoughts over. I heard back from their office, from Simon Stevens' office, saying, thanks for bringing this to our attention. We'll look into this. And I didn't hear anything further. So it might be that they were always planning to send this letter. It might be that they've independently come across it. But certainly I know I brought it to their attention. And lo and behold, a little while later, this incredibly strong letter gets sent not just to the PSA, but to every national newspaper. So it might actually be that we played some part of it at Good Thinking to get this whole wheel moving.
Great, Marsh. Thank you very much for that quick update, and I'm going to be very interested to see what's going to happen over the next few weeks with the response from the homeopaths and various people crying foul and bringing up all sorts of objections. But I think things are on the right track.
It definitely feels that way, and fingers crossed in the next few months I'll be able to come back and advise you of the next kind of victory in our campaign.
Absolutely. Once again, Michael Marshall from the Good Thinking Society, thank you very much.
Thanks, Richard.
And this comes from the Daily Mail Online, dailymail.co.uk. NHS Chief Simon Stevens blasts homeopathy as dangerous and blames the industry for fueling anti-vax myths. Simon Stevens has urged medical watchdog to delist Society of Homeopaths, described some homeopaths as chances who con public to part with money, but the group says it does not promote any treatment contrary to NHS guidance. This is by Sophie Borland, and it was published on the 28th of October. The head of NHS Today launches an outspoken attack on the homeopathy industry for peddling deadly anti-vaccine myths. Simon Stevens accuses practitioners of spreading toxic misinformation about jabs which pose, quote, a significant danger to human health, end quote. In a key intervention, he urges the medical watchdog to delist the Society of Homeopaths from its official register of professional organizations, saying the body's inclusion sends a message to patients that homeopathic remedies are as safe and effective as clinically tested medicines. Mr. Stevens describes some homeopaths as chances who are conning the public to part with their hard-earned cash. He also warns that some therapists are pushing ineffective homeopathic vaccines which leave patients exposed to deadly diseases such as measles. But the Society of Homeopaths, the UK's largest group of registered practitioners, insists that it does not promote any treatment contrary to NHS guidance, including vaccinations. The item goes on to say, in his letter, Mr. Stevens says he has serious concerns about the Society's inclusion because the practice of homeopathy remained fundamentally flawed. He said its accreditation would give a false impression to patients that homeopathic remedies are as trusted as the treatments used by doctors, nurses and other professionals on the register. Quote, this is a vital issue at a time when there is a rise of misinformation about vaccines, some of which is apparently promoted by homeopaths, and which poses a significant danger to human health, end quote, he adds. Emphasizing his point last night, Mr. Stevens said, quote, anything that gives homeopathy a veer of credibility risks chances being able to con more people into parting with their hard-earned cash in return for bogus treatments which at best do nothing and at worst can be potentially dangerous, end quote. We read on later where Michael Marshall is quoted. Michael Marshall of the pro-science charity Good Thinking said, quote, any organization or practitioner who is spreading anti-vax myths is particularly dangerous right now, end quote. The Mail is urging the government to launch a mass publicity drive advocating the safety of vaccines. And that particular story comes to us from the Daily Mail, dailymail.co.uk, and I will put a link in this week's show notes.
Sweet cappuccino, soy latte.
Hey, Richard.
Oh, hi, Trish. Hi. Would you like a coffee?
Yeah, thanks. What are you working on?
I'm trying to come up with a new promo to play on the Skeptic Zone.
Who's it for?
The Good Thinking Society in the UK. You know, the...
Oh, yeah, I know them. The guys who recently chased the homeopaths out of the UK public health system.
Oh, did they?
Yeah, they campaigned and lobbied government for a while, and now you cannot get homeopathy on the NHS. So they can now spend public money on healthcare that works.
Oh, right. Look, I'll mention that in the promo. Now, their website is goodthinkingsociety.org.
And that website is a good resource for learning more about quackery.
Ah, thanks, Trish. That gives me something good to think about.
Hi, this is Rob Palmer, also known as the well-known Skeptic. I write for such publications as The Skeptical Inquirer, and I'm also involved with the Guerrilla Skepticism on Wikipedia project, GSOW. This week, I bring you part 2 of my interview series from CSICon 2019 in Las Vegas. I talked to Elizabeth Loftus about false memories, Jim Underdown about investigating paranormal claims, Janyce Boynton about facilitated communication, and Joe Schwarcz about demystifying science. just ran into Elizabeth Loftus, and she's going to be a speaker at the conference. Right now she's signing an autograph of witness for the defense for Ed Bear.
There you go.
And now I'm going to ask her.
Thanks for your help, Ed.
My pleasure. So thanks for doing this interview.
And, sure. I'm glad we could do it this conveniently.
What is your presentation going to be about?
Well, it's called The Fiction of Memory, and it's about research that I and other psychologists have done on how it is that people come to believe and remember that they did things or saw things that they didn't do or see. How do people develop false beliefs and false memories?
So does that include when someone maybe misremembers something, so there actually was an event, but they don't remember it properly?
Well, that's part of the work,
okay.
and many of the experiments that I've done show how easy it is to change people's memory for an event that they actually did see. But what's even more stunning is when we can plant an entire event in the minds of people for something that didn't happen.
Wow. Give me an example.
Well, make them believe that they were lost in a shopping mall and frightened and crying, or that they were attacked by an animal, or they witnessed a person being demonically possessed.
When that never happened at all. Nothing.
When it never happened.
That's amazing. And that, that's really amazing, because people I know on even mundane things don't think, they challenge me. It's like, no, I cannot be wrong. I remember that exactly, and you cannot convince me otherwise. And it's a little thing, but this is like a huge thing, and people make it up in their minds.
These are huge, what we call rich false memories.
Wow. So how did you get involved in this kind of research?
I was a graduate student studying psychology, and I started to do some work with a professor on memory, just really very theoretical kinds of memory work. And then after I got my PhD, I wanted to study memory for something that really mattered, like the memory of people for crimes, accidents, and other events that would be important to the legal system. And began to design experiments, and now I've got 40 years of having done them.
Wow, fascinating. And so, all right, so besides the memory issue, what other aspect of pushing back on pseudoscience or alt-med, and that, what interests you? What aspects?
Well, mostly I'm a scientist who studies memory and how memory can go awry, and my plate is full just thinking about the problems in the world.
Thank you much for the time.
Okay,
and
sure.
I'm looking forward to hearing you talk.
All right.
I just came from my first workshop here, which was The Investigators, which was a joint presentation by Kenny Biddle and the gentleman standing in front of me. And please introduce yourself.
I'm Jim Underdown, Executive Director of the Center for Inquiry West and Chair of the Center for Inquiry Investigations Group.
And what was your presentation about? Workshop, say?
Yeah, just techniques of investigations that we've had over the years, and bringing up examples, trying to highlight some of those techniques.
Okay, and you split the time with Kenny, and you guys talked about slightly different things, and then we had two different exercises at the end. So you want to describe what yours was? I found that interesting. I participated in that.
Yeah, the case we did that people would try to solve was something called the Charlotte Angel, which is a real case involving a light-based angel that shone upon a wall in a intensive care unit at a hospital in Charlotte, North Carolina, immediately after a sick young girl was taken off her respirator, and she apparently improved right away after the angel was spotted, and her mother and some of the nurses on staff attributed her improved health to the presence of the angel, alleged angel.
And so then as a participant in this, what we did was there were three supposed witnesses, so I guess we're using testimony that was recorded somewhere, and we were able to ask them questions. That was quite fascinating. How did you prep those people?
I was on a show called Miracle Detective, and we actually investigated this case. So I looked at some of that old footage and got some of the actual testimonies from the mother, the real mother, and one of the nurses who was involved. And then we created the third witness just based so...
The hospital admin person.
A hospital admin, so you guys would have someone to go to to ask about the setup of the hallway and all that stuff.
I know, I thought it was clever that when you asked the sort of wrong category question to a person, they would say, no, I don't know anything about that, talk to the other person.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's like real life, if you were going to talk to the real people involved.
Yeah, right. I mean, ask any cop or any lawyer, asking the right questions is a huge part of their jobs.
All right, so that I had fun myself and learned a lot. And so I'm asking this to everybody else also. Who are you also most interested in seeing present at this conference?
Boy, it's a long list. Brian Greene, I'm a big fan of Elizabeth Loftus's work. But there are a few things a few presentations of people that I don't know that I think might be interesting. So
it's going to be a good weekend.
Yeah, it's going to be fantastic. I'm glad to be here.
Okay, thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you.
Wandering the halls of CSICon again, and I ran into a featured speaker from yesterday's lineup, and she happens to also be a member of the Guerrilla Skeptics team, and she did a presentation on facilitated communications. Please introduce yourself and give us an overview of your talk.
Hi, my name is Janyce Boynton, and I gave a talk about facilitated communication, which is a discredited technique that's used with people with severe communication difficulties. Unfortunately, even though it was debunked in around 1994-95, it's still being used at universities and colleges and promoted as a valid technique, even though it isn't a valid technique. So the talk was kind of a history, short history about FC, and also some thoughts about why it still continues to, the psychology behind it,
And the thing that personally fascinated me, and I knew of this before, is that you were personally involved with this.
Yeah, I became a facilitator. FC was introduced in the United States around 1990. I became involved with it in 1992. It was still kind of in the spreading across the United States stage, so people were pretty enthusiastic about it. The evidence-based research hadn't quite developed to the point that it has now, and yeah, I became involved with it. And unfortunately, in my situation, it turned into a situation where we needed to test the case that I was working on. And it turns out, and I learned through double-blind testing, that I was the author of the FC messages. And the science actually has, since then, has backed up my personal experiences. At any time facilitated communication is tested in controlled settings, the facilitators are always the ones not only influencing the messages coming out through facilitated communication, but they're actually controlling it. So
what's the reaction been to people who still do facilitated communications?
Well, they don't believe in the evidence-based testing. In fact, you're not even supposed to test it. They consider it an affront to people with disabilities to actually test the messages. So the reasoning that they use in their own studies, it kind of runs along the lines of FC works because people saying FC say it works, or using FC say it works. So a little bit of circular reasoning.
And that's
there.
so much like other things like that can't possibly work, like homeopathy, for example.
Sure.
There are people who swear it works, and since they swear it works, it has to work.
Yeah. I happen to believe that because the evidence hasn't changed people's minds about facilitated communication, I think it's more of a belief system than actual, it's not a communication technique. Yeah.
But as I understand it, there are actually agencies which have come out publicly against it now, right?
Sure. There's over 20 major organizations like American Speech Language and Hearing Association in several different countries, not just America, but Canada and Australia. A lot of the behavior analysis organizations have opposition policies, as well as organizations like the International Society for Augmentative and Alternative Communication. There's also, I want to just highlight one, it's called Lake Region Community College, and they have a policy opposing facilitated communication for people coming into their college to take classes because they can't tell the difference. They can't tell who's actually doing the coursework, the person with disabilities or the facilitator. So they allow people with and encourage people with disabilities to come into the classrooms, but they need to be using valid augmentative and alternative communication devices and techniques that show that they are independently doing the classwork.
And if I recall right from your presentation, you mentioned Syracuse University as people still saying this is real?
Yeah, Syracuse University is kind of ground zero. It's where facilitated communication started in 1990, and it continues to promote facilitated communication today, despite all the evidence. And that's an interesting case because so the Communication Sciences department in Syracuse University has an open statement that they do not support facilitated communication because they're evidence-based. But the Institute for the Center for Community Inclusion, I think that's the name of it, is it's through the education department, and they're heavily promoting facilitated communication.
Oh, that's a shame. Very fascinating subject.
So fascinating. The whole conference is great. I've really had a good time here. So
okay,
yeah.
Thanks for your time.
Well, thank you.
So we just finished the first session of CSICon speakers, and I ran into a speaker himself, and he's speaking tomorrow. And could you please introduce yourself and tell us what your topic is?
Hi, I'm Joe Schwarcz. I'm from Montreal, McGill University, and I direct the university's Office for Science and Society, where our mandate is really to demystify science and separate sense from nonsense. And my background is chemistry, so I deal a lot with that. And the topic that I'll be addressing is getting the chemistry right, because there are so many things on the internet where they get the chemistry wrong. And, it's obviously, we know people like the food babe, etc., who are not very well versed in any aspect of science. So not surprised that they get things wrong.
Hari.
Yeah, but sometimes, there are people who are sort of legitimate scientists who get things wrong too, because they are outside of the area of their expertise.
So you tackle both of those?
Oh, yeah, we tackle both of those. And we do some hard science as well, explaining the role of chemistry in everyday life. And I focus also a lot on nutrition, because the human body, of course, is the most complex machine on the face of the earth. And we put the most complex things that we call food into it and expect to get simple solutions, but there aren't any. So we deal a lot with that. But tomorrow I'll be taking a look at some issues, for example, whether or not heating plastics in the microwave oven releases toxins. And I'm going to address one particular issue, because there's a lot of talk out there that if you heat plastics in a microwave oven, you get dioxins. And people have heard of dioxins, which indeed are a problem. The tetrachlorodibenzodioxin is probably the most toxic substance ever made, although it's never made on purpose. It's always a byproduct of some process. However, they get the chemistry wrong when they talk about heating plastics in the microwave, because in order to get dioxins, you must have chlorine in the environment. This is a chlorinated compound.
Oh, okay.
And where they basically launch their attacks from is the knowledge that if you incinerate polyvinyl chloride, which is a very commonly used plastic, you can generate dioxins. But the vessels that we use in the microwave oven are not made of PVC. They're made of polyethylene or polypropylene. There's no chlorine in sight, so they cannot possibly produce dioxins. Furthermore, the microwave oven is not an incinerator.
Right. Okay, makes sense. Cool. I'm looking forward to that. And McGill is well represented at this conference. Jonathan Jarry?
Jonathan Jarry works for me, and he's going to be talking about some of the victories that we've had in fighting pseudoscience.
Very cool. I'm looking forward to that. And what speaker, besides Jonathan, are you most interested in hearing?
I'm interested in Jen Gundry. I've followed her, and she's very adept at getting her points across. Mm-hmm. And I followed the climate change argument. So
you're coming to the luncheon with Michael?
I'm
going to that also.
I'm coming to the luncheon. And I'm very interested in hearing Mickelson, the gentleman who started Snopes.
Oh, yes, that should be fascinating.
There's a lot of good stuff. And also, I just had the chance, walking in the hall, of meeting royalty, because I met James Randi.
Oh, yes.
And I've known Randi, admired him for a very long time. And 10 years ago, he was our guest in Montreal for a symposium that we do annually, the Chartier Public Science Symposium. And so I've met him many times since that time. And it's always a thrill because, he really is the god of skepticism.
That's amazing to see him here. Yeah, we found out just the day before we got here that he was coming. I don't know if it was last-minute plans, he wasn't, sure himself, or they just kept it under wraps. But that was quite a nice thing to see him. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Looking forward to hearing your lecture.
Thanks.
That was part 2 of my interview series from CSICon 2019. Join me here on the Skeptic Zone next week for part 3.
Now here are some announcements from the skeptical world. Things you can go and see and do. The Bay Area Skeptics inform us that Dr. Eugenie Scott will be talking at the San Francisco Exploratorium after dark. Now, the Exploratorium is a wonderful interactive science museum located on Pier 15 in Embarcadero. This is Thursday, the 7th of November, Thursday night, and that's from 6 p.m. until 10 p.m. The theme for the evening is a skeptical one, matters of fact. How can we know the truth? Do facts matter? What distinguishes justified belief from opinion? And why do our personal biases keep us from seeing the whole picture? Join us to learn more about the anchors of scrupulous science and digital data, and how they can be exploited, and the tools to find the facts for yourself. Bay Area Skeptics President Dr. Eugenie C. Scott will be giving a presentation on why do people reject good science? And the Bay Area Skeptics will have tables demonstrating how to think about and analyze pseudoscientific claims. In addition, there are the usual hundreds of interactive Exploratorium exhibits for you to play with. It will be a fun-filled evening for adults. Alcohol is available. Once again, that's Thursday, the 7th of November, and I will add a link in this week's show notes. And the Canberra Skeptics, right here in Australia, are presenting a talk, Effective Altruism, How to Do the Most Good. And that's Tuesday night, the 12th of November, 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. at the Belconnen Community Service, which is in Chandler Street, Belconnen. Effective altruism is a philosophical and social movement that uses evidence and reasoning to determine the most effective ways to benefit others. It sounds like a fascinating talk. I wish I could go to all these talks. Anyway, dinner will follow the lecture. To RSVP for the dinner, please email the Canberra Skeptics, canberraskeptics@gmail.com. And for more information, head to www.canberraskeptics.org or follow the link in this week's show notes.
Hi, my name's Tim Mendham. I'm the Executive Officer of Australian Skeptics, and I'm also the editor of our magazine, The Skeptic. And I'd like to cover another little article that's published in the magazine. This one is from our section we call Readers Indigestible, which basically looks at a whole range of websites, publications, that sort of thing, from either the paranormal end of the scale or from some more serious, skeptical ones. This one looks at geeks, gamers, nerds and kids and came out of the Skeptic, published in March 2019, which was volume 39, number 1. In an article in The Guardian, published in November 2012, Deborah Hyde, who was then the editor of the UK Skeptic magazine, unfortunately the magazine is no more, although there's a website, she described the rise of skepticism, specifically looking at the proliferation of major skeptical events, blogs, podcasts, vodcasts, and sundry other casts. What is driving this change, she asked. The nerd factor is undoubtedly in the mix. Previously a derisive term and somewhat like the other, N-word and queer, it has been reclaimed by its former victims and is now regularly wielded with pride. I sense that this rise in social status of the technically gifted and sartorially socially impaired is probably related to the growth of the IT sector. Nerdy is cool. Do you remember the old TV show about radio hams and chemistry students? Me neither. But now we have the IT crowd and Big Bang Theory and Brian Cox. Nerds have clouts and nerds are cool. So that's her words. It is the case that a perhaps surprising proportion of skeptics, and especially young ones, work in IT. So there is a strong nerd factor in many skeptical meetings and discussions. Perhaps skeptical meetings fulfill a social need that nerds and geeks find difficult to fulfill elsewhere, except, of course, through online multiplayer gaming. In a 2010 skeptic blog entry titled "Why Are Nerds So Unpopular?", Dr. Steve Novella, the founder of the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, says that culture is slowly moving in the direction of valuing smarts, even nerdiness. He says Bill Gates and his ilk are to blame for this to some degree. We now celebrate the alpha nerd, Steve says. Kids see wealthy, powerful nerds with their attractive mates, and they get the message. Computers have done this. Once the sole domain of nerds, they are now chic. That chicness may, however, only apply in higher education and beyond. Nerds in high school are often avoided, if not picked on. Alexandra Robbins, who is the author of The Geek Shall Inherit the Earth, which came out in 2011, says that many of the differences that cause a student to be excluded in school are the identical traits or real-world skills that others will value. Love, respect, or find compelling about that person in adulthood and outside of the school setting. So what's bad when you're young is not so bad when you're older. In 2010, Jules Evans, on his Philosophy for Life website blog, wrote that the rise of skeptics has gone hand in hand with the rise of geek culture, like superhero comics, sword and sorcery fantasy, and science fiction. Many skeptics are also science fiction, fantasy and superhero nerds who will attend both TAM and Comic-Con. Indeed, some comic conventions now hold skeptic side events. You could speculate that the skeptics have rejected organised religion. Instead, they construct their own disposable religion out of Batman, Gandalf, Mr. Spock and other pop culture icons. Superhero movies, which are now mainstream blockbusters, often tell the story of the rise of the geek, from nerdy outsider to all-powerful dominant male. You just have to think of Superman or Iron Man or the Hulk to see examples of that. It is the story of the scientific intelligentsia, their own rise to power since World War II, turned into myth and endlessly resold and retold. So that's Jules talking about that one. But what is out there online of a skeptical nature specifically for geeks, gamers, nerds, and those kids who look forward to joining that fraternity, and it's largely seen as a male group, though the mix is definitely changing? The answer is it can be difficult to find. Geek communities can be very insular and close-knit, which is understandable considering their experience in younger years. You may need to be on the geek grapevine to pick up the best places. As Amy Whitcroft, self-professed nerd and founder of Nerd Night social events in Wellington, New Zealand, she told a New Zealand Skeptics Conference in 2013, forming communities around interests and beliefs is pretty common behaviour amongst people. Nerds, geeks, whatever you want to call them, are no different. And in fact, they tend to do so very enthusiastically. The problem is, information on them was slight. She says, I've had a look for data about them, about this movement, and well, it's not really there. But I do know that nerds and nerd communities are everywhere. Personally, I'd like to put out a call to all the listeners to this podcast to let me know your favourite geek or nerd site that also features scientific skepticism. One that does crop up and that is worth looking at is one called AITP. Now, the cliched image of an avid video gamer is an adolescent male tucked away in their room tapping furiously at their keyboard. In actuality, the average age of a gamer is definitely adult. Some sources say about 35 years old. with almost equal share between male and female. Well, the women tend to use mobile games. Estimates of the size of the gaming markets vary, but one source puts the current figure at a high of US $136 billion. Others a bit more modest, saying it's only between 90 and 100 billion. That puts it almost double the size of the movie and music industries combined, and third place behind broadcast and cable television. So the gamer community is significant. While serious gaming has only been going for 30 plus years, that's not including the arcade games like Pong and Pac-Man, that sort of thing, comics have been on the market since the early 20th century. Japanese manga go back even further. Comic book sales nowhere near match those of gaming, but there are content overlaps with many games based on comic book characters. Movies based on video games are rarely successful, either critically or financially, but those using comic book characters, such as the plethora of superhero action films, have struck a deep vein of gold. The 56 films based on Marvel Comics, that's 56 and counting, that includes Iron Man, the Hulk, Spider-Man, etc., not to mention the Avengers. Those that have been released worldwide have grossed a combined $31 billion US. This is serious business, but why do we mention in a Skeptic podcast or even a Skeptic magazine where this thing came from? Well, apart from the nerd factor, which is often shared between skeptics and gamers, there is at least one site that takes both aspects very seriously indeed. AIPT, comics, which is www.adventuresinpoortaste.com, was started by two people as a blog in 2011. It has now grown to dozens of contributors, and some of them are women. It changed its name to AIPT Comics to avoid any negative communications or connotations, and Adventures in Poor Taste probably gives away some of that the problems that were raised. And it's now sporting much scientific content alongside the information on comics, gaming, TV, movies, and wrestling for some reason. Some of this is the science of superheroes. But Russ Dobler, who's the editor of the science section, says that, yeah, there's a whole category for that, but we also like the methods of science, not just the facts. That's why there's another whole section for skepticism, science's loud-mouthed little brother. That's his words. In fact, AIPT denotes February every year as Skepticism Month. Skepticism in pop culture and skepticism of pop culture. But it's not just pop culture, there are heavyweight contributions. A professor of biology at the City University in New York contributed a book review taking down creationism. Another expert took a decidedly critical look at a new TV program on paranormal videos. Just two examples of the many that are skeptical in this website. This is not nerd fanboy stuff, which is not surprising as Dobler is also the newly elected president of the New York City Skeptics. He says, I believe in getting beyond the echo chamber to reach the people who really need it, and pop geek culture is a great way to do that. The more skeptics that get involved, the better the numbers look, and the more leverage we have to open other doors in mainstream media. There's a lot of good reading out there, even if you're not a gamer, and this site is highly recommended by myself, not just for the content, but also because it takes skepticism into an audience that might previously have been largely unaware of what scientific skepticism really is. As a postscript to that, you have to look that it's not just gaming and stuff. Nerds are also highly fashion conscious. That might be an exaggeration. So while you're looking at the gamers' sites, think about the look of a nerdishness. And the look of nerdishness would not be complete without mentioning the nerdiest, coolest t-shirt company, Snorg Tees, which is snorgtees.com. Founded in 2004, the range features pop culture references, bad puns, and sometimes quite heavy scientific concepts. The founders say they started the company in their basement and faked everybody into thinking that we own an actual business. We've even shipped a t-shirt to NASA. That means space. So technically, we're a universal company. So wear your nerdiness with pride. And that was Geeks, Gamers, Nerds and Kids from the pages of The Skeptic, March 2019, volume 39, number 1.
Hi, this is Steve Novella from the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe podcast. Me and my fellow rogues are really looking forward to coming down to Melbourne, Australia for SkepticCon 2019 in December. We hope to see all of our skeptical friends down there. So, hey, we'll see you guys all down in Melbourne in December.
Hi, I'm Dr. Brad Mackay, and I'll be seeing you at SkepticCon 2019. I'm a GP and I have patients coming in with all sorts of weird and wacky home remedies. So we're going to be having a look at those and seeing which ones work and which ones aren't quite so successful.
Thank you for listening to the Skeptic Zone this week. Coming up on next week's show, the final part of the CSICon interviews with guest reporter Rob Palmer. More news and interviews about the upcoming Skepticon convention right here in Melbourne. And as ever, the rest is in the lap of the gods. Sometimes I really don't know what's coming up on next week's show. Thank you to those new Patreons who have come on board to help support the Skeptic Zone financially. Every cent of the money you send in does go to help the Skeptic Zone stay on the air in your ears on the internets. And thank you to those people who have made other contributions lately, much appreciated. I think I'm still trying to recover from last night's wonderful Sri Lankan curry dinner. I'm going to be recovering for the rest of the week, I think. But until the next week's show, this is Richard Saunders signing off from Melbourne, Australia.
You've been listening to the Skeptic Zone podcast. Please visit our website at www.skepticzone.tv for show notes, contacts, and to access the back catalogue of episodes going back to 2008. You can follow the Skeptic Zone podcast on Twitter at Skeptic Zone, visit our Facebook page, or leave a review on iTunes. You can also support the Skeptic Zone via Patreon or PayPal. The Skeptic Zone podcast is an independent production. The views and opinions expressed on the Skeptic Zone are not necessarily those of Australian skeptics or any other skeptical organisation.